Uh, Good morning, everybody, except for the East Coast where it is probably 12. It's noon now. I think my math is right. I am excited and blessed and honored and privileged to bring us yet another session of Howard's University. We are continuing our lecture on re-examining the civil rights movement. And last time we started, man, it was really, really good. And y'all gave us some great feedback and we got into it. So Dr. Fuller has some ways that he wants to continue and go on with it. But before we jump into that, man, tell these people how you doing today, Dr. Fuller. How are you?
Hey, man, like I tell people all the time, Charles, and I mean this, man, like I'm blessed in the sense that I have food, clothing, shelter, and a certain amount of money. And what I really worry about, man, is all of our people who have none of that or very little of that, right? Or are not in good health. So whatever my complaints are, man, when I think about the suffering of our people, it's, it's minimal, man. So I'm good. I'm just really happy to be here. I want to make sure before we get started that I really take the time to have people understand how much I appreciate you, my brother, and the fact that you agreed to do this with me and produce it and, and make it happen. And you don't take enough credit for that. And so I want to make sure that we start out the day by giving you credit for that, and that everybody know like how much I respect and love you. Appreciate what you do, my brother.
Man, that means a lot, man. You are a titan to me. You are somebody that I look up to, and I just learn a lot from. I've been, we were just talking about this, but I've been blessed to be around some amazing people in various fields. Even in healthcare and here, and we were just talking about, Elaine Brown and how she's helped me out in the past and stuff, man. I just think that you have so much knowledge and lived experience. You're like moving history in a sense where it's like, oh, I remember reading about these things. And when you have somebody there to color it for you, it just means a lot. So, I hope you all appreciate this. All this is a series of stories. It's a series of stories that inform our past, that have implications for our future. And when we get blessed to have an amazing storyteller, I want to make sure that we are able to properly lift that up, man. So thank you so much. I'm super humbled by it. And, I will be producing other ones like this. So I'm working on one for Jamie. And we're trying to get that going soon. I just had with all the stuff that was happening last week, I got a little off track, but we'll get that up. And so, but you helped start this, man. So thank you very much. And let's go ahead and jump in, because I don't know if we're gonna get through everything on this episode either. But there's some good stuff.
Yeah, we're gonna see how far we get.
Hey man, we ain't gotta rush it. We own this. We ain't gotta rush it. We take
we ain't on no timetable, right?
Nah.
So again, before I pick up from where we left off last week, I just want to make sure that people understand what it is that we're trying to do here. Number one, it really is to give people information about the civil rights movement. And the idea is for people who really have heard about it, don't know very much about it, to give you some color to it, but also give you a basis to do more research on your own if you think that this is something you want to know more about. And for the educators out there, it's to give you some ideas as to how you might cover this period of history with your students, particularly those of you who are dealing with high school students or middle school students. And so hopefully some of the information that we give you will give you some ideas about how to approach talking with them about it. And then obviously, we want you to try to make connections between what it is that's happening today and some of the things that have happened in the past. And how, although it seems like history is repeating itself, I make the argument that history doesn't move like in a circle like that, but that history moves like this. So that even though something may be repeating itself, it's not repeating itself under the same historical conditions. And so that means that your strategy, your tactics have to be different. So let's get back into this idea of strategy and tactics. So the way I want to try to, run this past you, and then people may have their own ideas. So the way I always approach it is that you have an objective, then you have like a strategy, and then there are tactics. So the objective is, what is it that we're actually trying to accomplish? The strategy is sort of the long-term view about how to get to that objective. And then the tactics are like these things that you do on a day-to-day basis to try to uphold the strategy to get to the objective. So the way I look at the civil rights movement is that the objective was full democratic rights for Black people as citizens of the United States. And you remember that we talked about the difference between civil rights and human rights. And that was a discussion that took place not between Malcolm and King, but King sort of talked about civil rights, although he clearly also viewed things as human rights, except Malcolm wanted to focus on human rights and not on civil rights. But anyway, we're talking about the civil rights movement, which is tied to what is it that's supposed to be available to us and what rights we're supposed to have as citizens of the United States. So I'm saying that the objective of this civil rights movement, and we're using a period of really 1953 to about 1968 as the period of time that we're dealing with, so that the objective was full democratic rights as citizens of the United States of America. The strategy was to put pressure, economic pressure and political pressure on the system of the United States to make that happen for us to get these full democratic rights. There were the tactics. And so what we're going to do is to focus on 5 basic tactics that were used by the civil rights movement. And so those tactics were legal action, number 1, mass struggle, support services, electoral politics, and economic pressure. So let's go back and deal with each one of those. So when we talk about legal action, essentially what we're talking about is the strategy that revolved around persuading the legal system to enforce laws that upheld our citizenship rights. And so you would hear things like equal protection of the laws, equal enforcement of the laws. Well, how similar is that argument today? Equal protection of the laws, equal enforcement of the laws. And so using that tactic, there were injunctions filed, there were suits filed, defending Black people in court, seeking charges for violations of the law, including murder and bombings and all of that. So that what we would do is to try to get, quote, justice within the context of the legal system. And so if you read, if you're looking at it in a contemporary sense, you look at the work of Stevenson. And so if you read it, well, I didn't look at the Netflix thing, but I read the book, Just Mercy. It is one of the best, case examples of trying to use the legal system to try to bring justice to our people. And the work that Brian Stevenson has done, the work that brother's done has been phenomenal, but he's tied into a whole history of lawyers, going back, to the Thurgood Marshalls, the Derrick Bells, Robert Carter, all of these people. And then a lot of these local lawyers that people never heard about were like the soldiers in using that particular tactic of trying to use the legal system. The second thing was support services. And by support services, I meant trying to find Black people jobs, trying to do job training, trying to provide additional education so that we would be prepared to function as socially and economically productive citizens, seeking better housing. All of these ways of what I'm calling support services also took place during that period. The third thing was what I'm calling nonviolent mass struggle. That's where people put their bodies on the line. And I've heard a lot of young people today, well, if I'd have been back then, I would have done this and that. Well, you don't know what you would have done back then. You think you know. Right. But even if you look at what people are doing today, right, you got some people who are out there using marches and so forth, which were part of the nonviolent effort back during the civil rights movement. And so it's just using some of the same tactics. But what I'm talking about are sit-ins, marches, picketing, wade-ins, jail-ins. Wade-ins was an interesting one because that was when Black people were trying to integrate swimming pools. And so they would do wade-ins. And in fact, if you read a book, it's called Negroes with Guns by Robert Williams. This happened down in Monroe, North Carolina. And this started out because they were trying to, in fact, integrate the swimming pools down in Monroe, North Carolina. And it led to a shootout, and it led to Robert Williams becoming infamous and ultimately moving to Africa and founding, what was it, the new, I'll think of it in a minute, but it was like the New African Republic or something like that. I actually met him in Tanzania, very interesting brother. And but his book is Negroes with Guns. It's really an interesting book to read. And there's a fiction book called Black and White that I got to send you a copy of.
Okay.
And the author uses Robert Williams and me. He combines our personalities as the lead organizer in this fiction book called Black and White. But anyway,
dude, who are you? What is your life like? We just be talking about people. Oh yeah, oh you like Malcolm X? I was there when he gave battle. Oh yeah, you. Oh, Faces at the Bottom of the Well. That Derek Bell. Oh, that's my homie. That's my friend. And then just in Tanzania, dude. Well, you have lived a life, man. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Can't fan out while you're doing your lecture, but you just be saying stuff.
Yeah, I just have to throw that stuff in there. Okay. So,
that's awesome. I'm just saying, like that's just amazing.
And then the fourth was electoral politics, right? That's getting involved in the political process of the country, registering people to vote, voting, running people for office, trying to get laws passed or abolished or changed, right? So I put that under the category of electoral politics. And then the last one was economic pressure. And I was trying to put pressure on the economic structure to put pressure on the political structure, but also to try to get more engaged in economic activity. And so we use boycotts, we use economic demands, we use strikes. There were all of these ways that we use this tactic of economic pressure. So when you think about the civil rights movement, I want to posit those as like the 5 basic tactics of the civil rights movement. Again, legal action, support services, nonviolent mass struggle, electoral politics, and economic pressure. And, like, while I'm giving shout outs, because I see like Chanel is on, we always have to talk about Amiri Baraka for all of my friends in Newark, because Amiri Baraka was like a legend, man. And, his son now is the mayor of Newark, but we were friends. And Amiri, was a poet, he was a writer, but he was like this phenomenal activist, right? And so I just want to make sure that people recognize Amiri. But anyway, so those were the 5 basic tactics. Now, let me move over, Charles, and talk about the 5 key organizations. And then I'm going to come back and tie those organizations into the tactics, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
So the first organization we want to talk about, obviously, is the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Now, if you study the NAACP, and I've read a couple books, but there's some scholars out there who've done real deep dive into the formation of the NAACP. But just generally, you'll see that sometimes when you look it up and say, well, when was the NAACP founded? It will say February 12th, 1909, because that's when Mary Overton White and Du Bois and Monroe Trotter and Ida B. Wells and a number of other white people got together in New York, and they had this first effort to create the NAACP. So some people call that February 12th meeting as the formation of NAACP. But if you read other people, they will say that was the first meeting, and then they agreed to get back together in 1910 and that's when they actually created the NAACP. So there's a little, issues around when was it formed? Was it 09 or 10? But from what I've been able to read and study, that first meeting was in 09, but they agreed to get back together in 1910, and that's when they actually formed the NAACP. But you can really characterize it as the coming together of two movements: the Niagara Movement, which was Du Bois and those folks, and they call it the Niagara Movement because they met on the Canadian side of the border by Niagara Falls. And so they developed a list of demands that they wanted to make for Black people. Mm-hmm. Mary Overton White had been influenced by, she was brought up, I think, in New York, but she'd been influenced by some socialist writers. And then the thing that really got her going was the Springfield race riots. And so, and she had also got engaged in settlement house work, which was really very interesting. Studying the whole settlement house movement in this country is an interesting thing, particularly for those of you who are involved in social work, right? To understand sort of the history of the settlement house. But anyway, so
that's why I started my career, man. 5 years, social worker.
So they brought it all. They had this meeting. They came together, and they ended up creating the NAACP. The next organization really was the National Urban League. And the way that the National Urban League started out was there were these committees that got created in New York City. And so there was the Committee for Improving the Industrial Conditions of Negroes. That started like in 1906. And then the National League for the Protection of Colored Women, which was founded in 1905. And then the Committee on Urban Conditions amongst American Negroes was founded in 1910. Those three organizations came together to form the National League on the Urban Conditions among Negroes. And that ultimately became the National Urban League. So essentially the Urban League was formed like in about 1910. The official date they use is September 29th, 1910, when those three organizations came together to create what became the Urban League. Now, for some people, they will say that the NAACP was like a Du Boisian view. The Urban League was Booker T, right? And going back to that debate that was going on. But in any event, so you had the NAACP, the National Urban League. The one that a lot of young activists need to know more about is the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, because CORE was actually founded in Chicago in 1942. And they actually started out doing, confronting segregation in the North, in places like Chicago, for example. But then they became a part of the civil rights movement as we know it when they started the Freedom Rides. And so the Freedom Rides was when white and Black CORE members would get on buses in the North and they'd go to the South. And then when you got to the South, you were supposed to all the Black people would get in the back of the bus and the white people in the front of the bus. They refused to do that. And so there are videos of people being beaten, brutally beaten, when they got into some of these southern cities and refused to move to the back of the bus. So the Congress of Racial Equality was founded in March of 1942. But really, Charles, another part of it, and why I hope people will study this more deeply, is that when the Black Power movement started, which we'll talk about with SNCC and Kwame Ture and Stokely and Willie Ricks and all of them, CORE evolved from an interracial organization to a Black nationalist organization. And so if you look at CORE, particularly when Roy Ennis took over, and also during the period when Floyd McKissick, the brief period that Floyd McKissick took over CORE. Floyd McKissick is really someone that people ought to study. Floyd wrote a book called 3/5 of a Man, because he got into this whole question of why is it that Black people were defined as 3/5 of a human being in the Constitution for voting purposes. And he also founded a place called Soul City. And so that led to a whole debate about, because I think Nixon was president then, this whole idea of Black capitalism. And it's interesting when you look at sort of some of these Black folks who coalesce around Trump, which I don't want to get into. However, I'm just saying, but there have been always these Black folks who connected to, quote, conservative presidents using economics as a base. So looking at CORE would really be interesting, and to look at the evolution of that organization. But they were founded in 1942. Then there's the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was, so again, when you look at how SCLC got formed, so they had this meeting in Atlanta, January 9th and the 10th, in 1957. And, there were representatives of the Montgomery Improvement Association, obviously. Okay. And then there was about 60 people from 10 states, mostly clergy, that came together in Atlanta. And so now there's a lot of debate about what was the name of the group. And so I've seen three names. One was the Leadership Conference on Transportation and Nonviolent Integration, Negro Leaders Conference on Nonviolent Integration, and the Southern Negro Leaders Conference. At some point, it came out of that January meeting, but it became SCLC in 1957 in February when they had a meeting in New Orleans. So all the New Orleans people will claim, oh, yeah, people never talk about the fact that SCLC was actually formed in New Orleans, because it actually was. So they came together in February of that same year, and they ended up agreeing on the name, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they made Martin Luther King, obviously, the leader of that organization. And then the final one is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. The interesting thing about SNCC is that SNCC was formed in Raleigh, North Carolina, in April of 1960 at Shaw University. And I have to give a shout out to Shaw University because I taught for a semester at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the governor was insane when they hired me to teach the social work course. And because I was involved in a lot of stuff, and the governor was like, this is totally crazy. How can y'all hire him? So just before they got rid of me, I quit. And university was like, okay, man, you can come over here and teach. So I was able to teach like a semester at Shaw University. So I got a lot of stuff in my heart for Shaw. But the young people who were involved in the sit-in movements had this meeting at Shaw University in Raleigh in April 1960. And the person who really pushed them to form their own organization, interesting enough, was Ella Baker. Because Ella Baker was, really critical to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference doing their work. And if you look at them, they were like a male-dominated organization in the front, but the people who were making it go in the back were women, like Ella Baker. And so one of the things that Ella Baker talked about when the young people had to meet was, look, man, y'all got to form your own organization. And so that led to the creation of SNCC. Studying the history of SNCC is beautiful, man, because, again, it started out as this interracial organization. But then when James Meredith was killed, shot, trying to enroll in the University of Mississippi, and it led to the Meredith March. And then he was Stokely Carmichael then, but he became Kwame Ture. So he got involved in this march, and a dude named Willie Ricks, man, I love Willie, man. He's like one of these people you don't know about in history, but in any event. So they were moving from city to city. And so they got to one city, and Willie Ricks had organized people, and they started shouting Black Power. What we want is Black Power. And so then Stokely, Kwame Ture, gave this big speech about we want power. We want power. And so a real interesting book to read is the one by Carmichael, and I'll think of the other dude's name in a moment, but it's called Black Power. And so it gets into a whole analysis of Black power, because that became a very divisive thing, right? Because, you know, you have the old line civil rights people who are talking about integration. All of a sudden, here these young militant radical people talking about Black power. Mm-hmm. And it also led to a lot of consternation within SNCC, because, you know, the young white people who had been a critical part of SNCC became a whole question, well, what about us and all of this? So those are really like the five like key organizations of the civil rights movement. You know, the one that we're talking about between 1953 and 1968.
So let me ask a question. I mean, first off, just thank you for that. That was a marathon right there, man. There's so many people doing this work, and I think Dr. Newell said it in the comments. We didn't learn about most of these people, right? Like in schools. What's some of the most significant things? And I know this is a difficult and almost impossible question for you to answer, so give yourself grace. But what is something that you want the activists and the people that's like listening and trying to do this work and trying to learn from you? What do you want them to take away most from those five organizations? And you can weave in those tactics as well.
Yeah. So what I would ask them to do is that look at the organizational forms that we have today, right? Like, you know, Black Lives Matter, mm-hmm. or, you know, various local organizations, but also look at the various national organizations. And the thing we always want to learn is what is it that drove those organizations, and what is it that led to the, quote, demise of some of these organizations? Or what were the line struggles that took place within those organizations that made them less effective at different points in time? Because it's really important to understand these ideological and philosophical struggles that take place within organizations when they get formed, right? And some of it is around, obviously, tactics, but some of it is also just around broad, more philosophical issues. So it may be about strategy, it may be about tactics, but it may also be about objectives. Because what is the objective of our organization? What is that we're trying to accomplish, right? Mm-hmm. And then what is the relationship between the strategy that we've chosen and what we're trying to accomplish? And then what is the relationship between the tactics that we're using and the strategy and the objective? Because I think you have to do that type of analysis, because every time these organizations went through these difficult, like what we used to call line struggles, it led to disruptions, and it led to splits, and it led to, you know, sometimes making the organizations less effective. Sometimes people would argue made them more effective because they got more focused on where they needed to be at that particular moment in history. So, for example, if you talk to SNCC people, you know, who are still alive, people like Cleve Sellers, you know, there are others, Bob Moses, who people know really from the Algebra Project. You know, younger people know him from the Algebra Project. Mm-hmm. But to know him as a part of SNCC, or even if you talk to James Farmer Jr., because I don't know if people know James Farmer Jr. started the Maya Angelou Charter School. I've
never heard of him, so tell us about him.
Yeah, no, but I love that brother. But his father wrote the book, The Making of Black Revolutionaries, which is, I mean, his father was like this amazing man, right? And went through the whole struggles when SNCC and the Panthers tried to come together. And that's the whole history, Charles, you should know about, is that brief period when SNCC and the Panthers tried to unite. And there's a lot of stories about what happened in a particular meeting, and guns were drawn and stuff like that. But again, it relates to your question of how to look at these current organizations and what lessons can people draw from what happened to those organizations back during that period. Mm-hmm. So, but let me, because I want to come back to your question if I didn't answer, but let me just for a moment sort of link the tactics and the organizations.
Right.
So that from the legal action side, the NAACP really was the lead organization on the legal side of the tactics. When you look at support services, that was more the urban league's role in trying to do job training, et cetera. Although all of these organizations sometimes did some of each, I'm just trying to point to the lead given those tactics.
Okay.
The nonviolent mass struggle, you would have to say SNCC, right? Because of the young people engaged in the sit-in movement. But you'd also have to put the Southern Christian Leadership Conference there because of Martin Luther King and the ministers and all that. So if you read this book, The Parting of the Waters, which is really like a phenomenal sort of history of like SCLC and Martin Luther King and all of that. But there's a chapter on the Birmingham movement, and it's called the Children's Crusade. And it's a great chapter for young people to know about, because there wouldn't have been no letter from the Birmingham jail, man, if the Children's Crusade had not filled up those jails. And it's a way to show young people that they were a critical factor in where this movement went. And they were the, quote, foot soldiers. And so just reading even that chapter. So the whole nonviolent mass struggle part, SCLC and SNCC, but Charles Payne's book, I Got the Light of Freedom, it's like a crucial book to read in trying to understand, particularly the Freedom Democratic Summer, but the whole involvement of SNCC. But there is Howard Zinn wrote a book on SNCC, and another dude, I'll think his name in a moment, wrote a book on SNCC, which are really like worthwhile reading, right? Because particularly for young people to understand that particular organization, because it was made up of young people. On the electoral politics side, again, SNCC was involved, SCLC was involved, NAACP was involved. And by involved, I mean like doing voter registration drives, man. It's like a lot of people today, compare like the parent choice movement to the civil rights movement. I'm like, hey, man, let me tell you something. Before y'all start making comparisons, you need to understand, ain't nobody shooting at y'all for forming a school. Y'all got a debate on Instagram or whatever, and it's all good, but that ain't like people killing you. I mean, people died, man, trying to register people to vote. I mean, Chaney, Goodman, Schwerner, what do you think that was all about? They got buried at the base of that dam because they were down there trying to register people to vote. So I'm just saying that, understanding that history of SNCC, understanding those organizations being involved in mass struggle, but mass struggle was putting your bodies on the line and people died. Howard Zinn, he's a phenomenal historian. But anyway, so people died trying to get people registered to vote, trying to get people to run for office. And then when you go back and understand, like right now, I'm on chapter 7 in Du Bois' Black Reconstruction, and a significant discussion in chapter 7 is about the whole notion of giving Black people the right to vote after the Civil War. And so again, we should understand the price that Black people have paid in this country to vote. When people talk about, it don't mean nothing. Even if it don't mean nothing, it means something that our people died to get it. And I just believe that when people died like that, man, like we owe them something. So anyway, so electoral politics, mostly SNCC, NAACP, and SCLC. Economic pressure, again, it depends on how you want to look at it. It's the economic boycotts, because really the Montgomery bus boycott, that was an economic thing, right? To put pressure on the bus company, to put pressure on the political system to make significant changes. So again, all of these organizations were engaged in different parts of this. And so, for example, the NAACP may have been more focused on legal action, but there were local NAACP chapters who were a lot more militant than the national organization. I mean, like this sister, I'm trying to think of her name, from Wadesboro, North Carolina, man. She was like, oh my God. Just, you know, she was the head of a local NAACP chapter. And in a lot of places in the South, the NAACP chapter was the enemy of white people in very real ways. So if you read like Lost Education of Horace Tate, for example, you'll find that a lot of stuff that got accredited to the NAACP was really being done by Black teachers, but they couldn't say it because they were worried about getting fired. And so for a lot of you Black teachers out there who have just decided, oh, I'm just a teacher, you need to know the role that Black teachers have played in the history of the struggle of Black people in this country, right? And they've never gotten a lot of credit for it because they didn't always do it under the auspices of being a Black teacher. They did it under the auspices of other organizations. And in particular, as Vanessa Siddle Walker talks about in her book, The Lost Education of Horace Tate, a lot of the credit that the NAACP got was work that these Black teachers had done. So let me stop there, Charles, to see if you have questions.
Well, one, I'm taking notes and I helped build the show. So I have full pages of notes. And I know people really like when you give out those books, but this is what my notes are looking like in the moment as you're like talking, right? And I think, so I want to crystallize some clear lessons, right? Some clear messages, because you gave nothing but jewels. What are some things? Give me 3 things that you want to just bubble to the top, though, for our very engaged audience. And real quick before you do, if you are listening and you are enjoying this, we need your help as well. We need you to like this. We need you to comment, but we really need you to share it. And when you share it, like add a personal message to your networks, because we don't pay for marketing. We don't pay to get it out there. But we do think this is a message that people should be getting. And the best way is by the people that's listening to it. So if you're not feeling it, don't do it. But if this has moved you and you've gotten any value from it, it would help us out tremendously if you would take 10 seconds and just share this with a quick message. But back to your question, Dr. Fuller. Yeah, just 2 or 3 things that just from all that you want, because there are a lot of people right now that want to do good. There's a lot of noise in the air. And sometimes we need somebody with the type of wisdom you have to help us cut through the noise. So make that message plain for us.
Yeah, well, I think that if we can always be clear on the difference between objectives, strategy, and tactics, right? Because that's real critical. Because a lot of times, like, we fail as organizations because we're not very clear on what our objective is. Mm-hmm. We never really like lay out a strategy, and then we don't fold the tactics into that strategy. So we end up like with a lot of inconsistent messages. We end up with tactics that don't make sense because they're not tied into a strategy. And people keep asking, why are we still out here? Why are we doing this, blah, blah, blah. The extent to which you can be clear on what your objectives are, what your strategy is, and what the tactics you're going to use is like very, very important. The second thing is just understanding the organizational history and development of these organizations. And then it's always is what can we learn today, or what can young people who are struggling today and create new organizations and new frames, what is it that you can learn? I'm not trying to say you all got to do the same thing today that people did back then. All I'm saying is, are there any things that you can learn from how these organizations got formed, how they tried to wage struggle? And then the third thing, obviously, is the role, and I didn't really talk enough about this, but the role of the masses of people in making history. Because what happens is the way that people teach history is the great man and sometimes great woman, mostly great man theory of history. And what that does is it negates or doesn't highlight the role of the masses of people, right? So, for example, you might never have heard of Martin Luther King if Black people said, "Hey, man, we're gonna ride the bus." You got to think about the sacrifices that the masses of people made by not getting on that bus. The lives, and when we get into the Brown decision, for example, people really need to understand, man, like the role that so-called regular people play in advancing the interests of Black people, and that's happening today because a lot of times, of course, what happens is, certain ones of us get all the play, right? Oh, so and so, but what has to be understood is that you can't be the leader, ain't no followers. You can't, at a certain point, I don't know, there's this book called by Peter Senge, and it talks about, these 5, it's called, I'll think of it in a minute, but anyway, like he just talks about the role of a leader, for example, that Charles, like a great leader, number one, has to have like a mental model, right? Hey, this is where I'm trying to get us to. You got to be able to communicate that in a way that people understand it. But the most critical thing is that people have to buy into that, because if it's just you and your idea, you're not able to explain it. You're not able to like crystallize it in a way that people can see it, and you're not able to articulate it in a way that people want to become a part of it. Then how does that work? And so what I'm saying is that looking at these organizations and understanding the leadership roles that people play, but also understanding the roles that people play who were not in the leadership, both the masses of the people, but also people like Ella Baker. It just amazes me, man, how few people know about Ella Baker. But there was probably nobody more critical to the development of the civil rights movement than Ella Baker. You know what I mean? And either Moses or Charles Payne, I can't remember which one of them, wrote an article talking about the role that Ella Baker played. And to pick up her autobiography and read it would really be important. So that's what I would hope.
I appreciate that. I think, we talk about mental model, understanding the different roles. I think the one thing that you talked about was just the way in which we view like leaders, right? And I think that especially now, we got way more access to information than we had when you were coming up and doing this. You got social media, you got Twitter, you just got a lot more noise. And I know you talk about like sometimes this generation gets a little bit too more concerned with their brand versus like the actual work. However, I would push and say that some of that brand stuff, that like Twitter can lose your job. You know what I mean? Like you can lose your livelihood. What tips do you have to help people drown out the noise? Because I think, and I've seen that kind of come up in these comments as well, like, because it's a lot of noise out there. What advice do you have?
Okay, so the book by Peter Senge is called The Fifth Discipline.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the book. Okay, so, let me put it this way. Sometimes when I'm talking about things like brand and all of that, people just dismiss me.
Not at all.
No. I'm just saying that I'm not trying to be nasty or anything, but what I am trying to do is to make a point that at least I believe that if you put the development of your brand ahead of the struggle of our people, that's not a good thing.
Right.
And it's not like that hasn't happened historically. They just didn't use that terminology. Right? You've always had people out there, Charles, like who tried to promote themselves over and above the struggle. It's just that the mechanisms that they had to promote themselves are not like the ones that you have today. And the terminology that people use was not the same. Like, it probably wasn't fair, but back in the day, man, we used to call Jesse Jackson Jet Set Jesse, because whenever anything was going on, man, Jesse showed up, and people used to say, oh man, there he is again, blah, blah, blah. And so in the same way that I may talk about brand today, people were doing it back then. They just had a different terminology, and they didn't have as many avenues of putting their personal stuff out there as people have today. So it's not like this is some new phenomena. It's just the way it gets characterized. But
let me ask you a question. Let me get to
the drowning out the noise.
Yeah.
So when you talk to my students, what was that, 2 weeks ago?
And they killed it. Yes.
And you ask them, what is one of the things that he... And so what happened is I gave the twins, man, like Bose headsets with noise canceling. And what I told them was, put this on, because I need y'all to learn how to drown out the noise. I need you to be able to listen to the real music and not have the real music drowned out by all of the background noise. What I'm saying to you, Charles, is, I know, the only way not to get criticized out here is to keep your butt at home. And then people criticize you for being at home. But the point I'm trying to make is, at a certain point in time, you got to decide, this is what I'm focused on. All of that other stuff that's coming at me, I'm not going to deal with it. Now, I'm able to say that, but I should say many of you all in your generation, y'all feel like you got to respond to every single thing that happens on Facebook. You know what I mean? Like, if somebody says, I got to be out there. If somebody says it's on Twitter, somebody says it's on Instagram. And what I'm saying is, at a certain point, all that does is take you away from the thing that you focused on. And so at a certain moment in time, if you're trying to get something done, you have to develop almost like a singular focus on it. And you just have to say that some of this stuff that's coming at me, I'm not going to deal with it. I'm going to put my headset on, because to take time away from what I'm working on, and a lot of these people you're dealing with, Charles, they couldn't bust a grape. You understand what I'm saying? You give people power by responding to some of these fools, man, because it is your responding to them that gives them some play that they wouldn't otherwise have. I mean, I know people say, yeah, but they put something out there on Facebook. The person might have 2 followers, man, him and his mama or whoever. And you out there, I got to respond to it. So I'm just saying, everybody has to decide what constitutes background noise and what constitutes something that I need to respond to because it's necessary to advance the struggle. But I would contend that a lot of stuff that's out there does not advance the struggle. And the time you take away to respond to that takes your focus away from what it is that you're trying to get done.
Right. Well, can I ask you a question? So, because I want to learn.
I agree with that, Carmita.
Oh, from Carmita?
Yeah, I agree with that.
And Carmita, you have a phone call coming from me because we need to do that the Birmingham jail episode. So the question, I've always been curious about this, and I've asked Elaine Brown about it, and I want to ask you, being from Oakland and studying the Panthers, I remember in my research, because I wasn't around for it, but when Huey P. Newton and Eldridge Cleaver kind of had this infighting, and that kind of started, and it happened on a very massive scale. I feel like there's a lesson tied to what you just said there, but one, how did you experience that? Because I don't have the nuance around it. I just read it and, looked at old clippings. But two, what can we learn from that? So I want to know how you experienced it in that moment and how people were experiencing it. And then what should we learn from it?
Okay, so you got to remember, Charles, for me, from an experiential standpoint, I wasn't really paying that much attention to that because there was a split between the Panthers and those of us who were Pan-Africanists, right? And so I was a Pan-Africanist, so I was involved in that realm of struggle. And so whatever was going on with the Panthers, actually, I really didn't really pay that much attention to it. But I knew about it because I read Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver, which, really was an interesting book to read. And I saw some of the sort of stuff that happened between them, but I really did never know the ins and outs of that. But the general point is, like, I'll give you an example. So, like, when Michael McGee Sr. and I co-led the Coalition for Justice for Ernest Lacy, one of the things that Mike and I agreed to was that every night, and this literally happened, we would talk to each other. Because I said, Mike, what you got to do, man, is when people start talking stuff about me to you, you need to tell me. When people talk about you to me, I'm going to tell you. And so I used to get right up in people's face when they start talking to me about Mike, say, man, if you're going to tell me something about Mike, don't tell me unless you want him to know, because I'm going to tell him what you just said, and I'm going to tell him who said it. Because one of the things that happens, man, when you put these organizations together is the splits that occur. And a lot of them are around personalities. Also, some people get a little bit, about themselves. And they begin to see themselves as more important than the thing that you're doing, and all of these splits occur. Plus, you got to realize the police is involved, man. Like when you create, look, when I got my FBI file, I filed for my open records under both of my names, Howard Fuller, Owusu Sudoku. When they sent it to me, man, so much stuff was redacted, Charles. And a part of the reason it was redacted was because if they hadn't redacted, you could figure out who the police was. Because if there was only 5 of y'all in a meeting, and you ain't the police, then there's 4 others, and one of them is the police. And so part of the reason why they redacted stuff was because if you could really read it, you could figure out who the police was. So when you're out here with these organizations like Black Lives Matter, whatever, look, hey man, go no further than look at that thing that brother did on Netflix about who killed Malcolm X. One of Malcolm's X main bodyguards work for the police. And so one of the tactics that the FBI and all these other organizations use is to infiltrate organizations. And usually the most militant one is the police, because they're the ones that are trying to get you to do all kinds of stuff, man. And you're sitting there saying, man, I don't know if that's really a good idea. And so again, Charles, the only way I know that you can avoid some of these splits is that the people who are in the leadership have to agree to be brutally honest with each other about what it is that's going on. And people got to admit why they're in this. And this is hard to do. I'm just telling you, but I know how hard it is to do. And I've been involved in this a significant period of my life. Charles, look, man, when we had African Liberation Day demonstration in 1972, right? When I decided, after coming back from Mozambique, when I decided to organize African Liberation Day, I called together a bunch of people at Malcolm X Liberation University and say, hey, man, look, I want to put together this demonstration, and we need to do it on May 27, 1972, because it's the Saturday that's closest to the day that the Organization of African Unity had decided to support liberation movements. We can't have it during the week. We're going to have it on Saturday. Man, I will send you, Charles, if I never have, I will send you the stationery that lists the names of all of the people that, we got to be a part of the African Liberation Day Coordinating Committee. You won't believe the names that are on there. But the struggle that it took to get those Black people to come together and unify. I had people telling me, man, I remember I had just come back from somewhere and I put my bags down and they said, Wusu, man, you got to get to New York. And so I went to New York. It was Queen Mother Moore, Alombe Brave, all these people, man, who were the holders of Pan-Africanism. Their thing to me was, man, who the hell are you? to be organized in this demonstration. Back then, I was a little bit more irreverent than I am now. So who the hell are y'all? Like, I don't know none of y'all. And it was like, you can't be doing this because you ain't come through us. I'm like, I don't even know y'all, man. So what are y'all? That's true, KP. So what are y'all hollering at? So what I'm saying, Charles, is a part of the struggle is trying to maintain a level of principled unity, right? And it's going to always be difficult.
Principled unity.
Principled unity.
Somebody in the comments write principled unity so I can stay in the conversation. I'll post it on. Go ahead. Principled unity. Say more about that.
Well, here's what I'm saying. Like, the reason why you and I can work together is because, number one, you know that I ain't got no agenda. I don't have no hidden agenda. I know you ain't had no hidden agenda. When we decided to write that article way back then, it wasn't on the basis of, hey, man, this is what we're going to say. It was on the basis, if you will recall, you said, look, man, I'm going to put together a draft. I'm going to send it to you. I want you to look at it. I want you to put your stuff in it. If I did not trust you, if I didn't believe that, we in this together, then I'm going to be wondering, like, okay, well, why you had this sentence in there? What does this really mean? Blah, blah, blah. Principal unity, man, is when you and I say, look, man, we ain't going to have to agree on everything.
Right.
But what we do agree on is that we need to fight for our people. Right. And if there's any disagreement, we're going to talk about it openly. It's like, you can't be a part of an organization, man. And whoever you're working with, you're always wondering, is what they said really what they're about? Is there some other agenda that they have? How can that be principal unity, man? And if you don't have principal unity, how the hell are you going to move together as an organization? How's that work? It doesn't work.
Right. And this is the article that he's referring to. He wrote this article, man. It was 2017 already, man. My goodness, man. My God, man.
That was a lifetime ago.
Right? So much stuff has happened. So many things have like changed. All those young people behind you have graduated. It's
that's true.
that's wild, man. I will make sure that we have the link in for you all. I'm gonna try to post it right here, and hopefully it goes through. But man, this has just been amazing. I think you did an amazing job of setting up. I think you did an amazing job of just setting up like, hey, here's what happened. And let me actually paint some context around the civil rights movement. There are some nuances there. We didn't even get a lot of the headlines in school, let alone the nuances. And then I think you did a good job of giving us something to think about as we're doing this work right now, right? Like, stay focused. Don't succumb into the noise. Don't believe in this myth that you got to be perfect, or if you don't have the perfect profile, you shouldn't be out there lifting your voice. Like, don't let the anxiety become so big that you don't do what you need to do. And then I like ending on this concept of principled unity. I think that's just incredibly powerful, especially in this time where I think we're in a moment where there's some momentum happening. And I think we're starting to see, splintering inside of this Black movement. I do think that in some of these spaces it's becoming somewhat of a Black civil war. But again, I spend way too much time on Twitter, and I'm trying to be relaxed. But the reason why, and I think what's tough though, right, Doc, is that Twitter is just is more powerful than it should be, right? Twitter is one of those things. I don't think it's not good or bad. It's a tool. And you can use it for great things, and you can use it for negative things. And but what it does, it gives bullhorns to everybody. So you could have the top chemist in the country talking about something in his field, and you can also have a 21-year-old that just took a BA class, like, have more the same amplification, and they can get even further if they're savvy, right? So I just think that's a little scary for people. But this has been powerful.
But it's a beautiful thing, though, too, Charles, because the upside of that is you remove the power of the expert. The downside of that is you remove the power of the expert. Right? So that if you had a period of time, man, where You actually need to listen to some medical people who are telling you about the virus. But you can have an ignoramus who's the president of the United States, who's also a dangerous fascist, by the way. But they can start talking about drink bleach. You know what I mean? And then you got millions of people who will say that the person over here who actually knows about the virus, I ain't gonna listen to him. I'm gonna listen to a fool who's telling me to drink bleach, or you don't need a mask, or whatever it is, right? So that's the strength and the weakness of it, right? Is that you can challenge authority in ways that you couldn't before, which is a strength. The weakness is you can challenge authority in ways that you couldn't before, which can be a weakness depending upon what we're talking about at a certain moment in history. So, but that's a whole nother discussion. But Charles, what we need to decide before we roll up out of here, man, is you and I need to decide, and I guess the audience needs to decide as to whether or not we want to have one more session, and because I do think it would be good to get into some of these events, right, and put some color to these events, because now we've laid out the organization, we've laid out the tactics, but it would be, you know, just to come back and talk about, you know, the Baton Rouge bus boycott, which most people know very little about. You know, there are people down in North Carolina who argue that the sit-in movements did not begin with Woolworth, but it began with the Royal Cream ice cream parlor. So, you know, we need to talk about whether or not it would be worthwhile to go back and, you know, finish this by at least talking about some of those critical events.
Oh, well, Kelly already said we're doing part 3 of the civil rights segment. We've Kelly Fuller told us what we're doing already. So so we're gonna
always trying to tell me what to do now.
So we're gonna come back and we're gonna finish this arc. And I just want to thank you. And real quick, you mentioned something, and I want us to. I'll let you take us out after this, but for all those people that saying what they would have done in slavery times, what they would have done in civil rights times or whatever, well, your moment is upon us. Florida has decided that schools will be back in session without a very clear plan of what's going on with this coronavirus. And this will definitely impact poor people of all colors, but a lot of Black and brown people, where we are making a political move with the lives of children and their parents and their grandparents. So for everybody that had a lot to say about what they would have done, your moment has presented itself. God is funny in that way sometimes. Dr. Fuller, why don't you take us out? And then for the people, before Dr. Fuller closes out, if you enjoyed this, if you got anything from this, please help us spread the word and share it. I am not a good marketer. It is not my calling. And there's a lot of other things that's just happening. So we need your help. But Dr. Fuller, how do you want to take us out?
Hey man, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for doing this. I want to thank all the people who are with us. But again, hey man, like, over 130,000 people have died from this virus. Mm-hmm. Over 130,000 people. And you have a leadership in this country that really don't give a damn. And so I just implore you all to do what you can to be safe out there, and not listen to people who you shouldn't be listening to, and try to understand some of what people who actually know something about a virus are telling you. So be safe so we can get together next week.
All right. We will be back here at the same time. Many of you got the invite, the Eventbrite, we will mark it and get it out there, but just know, 9 a.m. on Pacific, noon Eastern time. We will be back here next Tuesday, and we will be doing part 3 of re-examining the civil rights and contextualizing this for today. For Dr. Fuller, I'm Dr. Charles Cole III. Thank you very much, and please enjoy the rest of your week and stay safe. Wear a mask. This curve we still got to flatten this curve, because our healthcare system is starting to feel that pressure again. I say that as somebody on the board of a major healthcare organization. So with that being said, we out of here. Good job, Dr. Floyd.
Empower, man.
Absolutely,
brother.